Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm just going to take a few moments to let people stream in and join us. Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this discussion segment of our Community Day, Say It Loud, a reflection of the 67 Newark uprisings, then and now. My name is Millicent Matthews, and I am the manager of traveling exhibitions here at the Newark Museum. And I will be moderating our discussion on the topic of inequality in art as we explore the intersections of social justice and the art world. Please note at the conclusion of our discussion, we will have a question and answer session. So please be sure to get your questions and comments in via the Q&A section on Zoom and through the comment section on Facebook Live today. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed discussion panelists, writer Aruna D'Souza and curator Trisha Loughton-Bloom. A brief bio on the two. Aruna D'Souza writes about modern and contemporary art, intersectional feminisms, and other forms of politics, and how museums shape our views of each other and the world. Her most recent book, Whitewalling, Art, Race, and Protest in 3 Acts, was named one of the best art books of 2018 by the New York Times. Her work appears regularly in 4columns.org, where she is a member of the editorial advisory board and has been published in the Wall Street Journal, CNN.com, Art News, Garage, Book Forum, MoMAs, Art in America, and Art Practical, among other places. She is currently editing 2 forthcoming novels, Making It Modern, a Linda Nochlin reader, and Lorraine O'Grady, Writing in Space, 1973 through 2018. And she is currently co-curator of the upcoming retrospective of Lorraine O'Grady's work titled Both and, which will open in March of 2021 at the Brooklyn Museum. Trisha Loughton-Bloom is the curator of American art here at the Newark Museum. Her current projects include Wolfgang Gill, Sonic Geometries, opening this fall, and a solo exhibition with artist Saya Wolflock, opening in October of 2021. And again, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the comments and Q&A sessions, and I will turn it over to Trisha.
Thank you, Millicent. And I really want to thank Aruna for being here with us today. It's an extraordinary time in many, many ways. And it's not quite the same as gathering at the museum in person, but it's still wonderful to have you and your incredibly rich and layered perspectives on what's going on now, what was going on during the civil rights movement. And if I could have the first slide. What we thought would be nice to do is just to, next slide, please. To situate ourselves at the Newark Museum and do the best we can with a few pictures, a sort of a virtual quick walkthrough of where the museum is now. If we were open right now, as soon as we're open, what you will see when you come to visit. So we start at the entrance. This is a view from last year. It looks like a summery day like today, but this is from 2016. And it's just a lovely shot of our recently renovated Washington Street entrance. This was a major kind of reorganization of our museum to invest in reopening the original entrance to this 1926 building. And so now you see you're greeted with these double doors and you can see inside the museum from the street. When you're inside, you can see the city. So that exchange has really been important, was a major improvement in working with the physical spaces that we have. The next slide, please. So when you walk into the museum, you're now greeted with this space, which we call the Welcome Center. It's a multi-purpose space It's our lobby, it's our reception area. I just want to point out the mural that's running along the top of the space there is by Odile Donald Odija, and it's titled Gateway. It was a commission in 2017 to celebrate the reinstallation of our African galleries. And 2017 was the 100th anniversary of our African collection. So I think the most important thing about the image on the left is that on the right-hand side, you can see, again, artwork. You can see into the new African galleries. These are new, brand new, fully renovated, fully reinterpreted in 2017 by our former wonderful curator of the Arts of Global Africa, Krista Clark. So the main point with these galleries is, again, updating the spaces, but also having a perspective that is really encompassing the whole diaspora. And it's, you know, it's pretty innovative. If you haven't experienced it, we look forward to having you visit. And the point here again being that it's the first gallery that you come to when you enter the museum, and you can enjoy the space. And on the other end, the large sculpture hanging there is another wonderful recent acquisition by Simone Lee. And then you continue on to the rest of the gallery. So it is really the way through to the rest of the permanent galleries. Next slide. So it's really been a busy series of what I would call just changing the geography of the museum over the past few years. In 2016, we moved our Native American galleries essentially to the threshold of our American galleries. So you can see here on the right, we commissioned a work by Jeffrey Gibson. This figure was a kind of tailor-made for this space and designed in its proportions to echo the sculpture down the hall, Hiram Powers, a Greek slave. And really to announce a shift in perspective. For us, it was pretty significant to put both the African collection and the Native American collections more in the flow of the museum. And it's been really amazing to see how that has impacted just the evolutions in the rest of the galleries. And do want to acknowledge that this reinstallation, Native Artists of North America, was done very much with a curatorial team of 5 Indigenous curators that, of course, brought so much more to our collection that it was a wonderful opportunity to research and learn more about the collection and have these really first-person approaches to interpreting. Next slide. And then again, if you haven't been really recently, in 2019, we did a major renovation of our American galleries. We retitled them Seeing America, with an implication of trying to take a broader and more multivocal view. And so you can see just a shot, like it's a much more clean, and we opened up the space a bit, but the biggest difference I really think is the interpretation and the great new works that we could bring out. Next slide, please. And just give you another, maybe closer up view of what the galleries look like now in Seeing America. And in the foreground here is an installation that we started it in 2015, but we have a really rich collection of African American art, so we've been able to keep switching it up. It's an installation that we call Civil Rights and the Art of Identity. And one of a few spots that are kind of permanent fixtures for highlighting the African American collection within the American galleries. And just to end with a wonderful work from the collection on the right, and Joan's High Priestess of Soul, really psychedelic portrait honoring Nina Simone, who was such a, of course, seminal personality and leading force in the civil rights movement that we felt she belonged, had a place in the discussion today. So with that, we can't wait to hear from you, Aruna, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you. Hello, my name's Aruna D'Souza. Are you hearing a reverberation in my voice or anything, or is everything sounds okay? I I'm really happy to be here. I've been a real sort of student of the Newark Museum for a long time. An old friend of mine and colleague, Carol Duncan, introduced me to the really innovative and interesting thinking of the museum's founder, John Cotton Dana, and the way in which he understood the museum to function as a kind of part of the community, a sort of vehicle for transforming Newark into a community, Newark as a place with many different immigrants from around the world, a place in which people of all races and walks of life were sort of coming together. And he really, and the sort of idea that a museum could sort of function not simply as a kind of neutral institution within this space, but a place that actually had an active role to play in creating community and shaping community and in allowing a sort of divergent group of people to see themselves as a community seems to me a really interesting model to think about at this particular moment in history, when we are once again forced to really reckon with the question of what is the purpose of a museum? What publics do museums serve? How should museums reflect those publics? How should museums kind of stand in relationship to the larger world in which they operate? So I think, it's particularly interesting to sort of think about all of these questions in a relationship to a museum whose history has really put those questions sort of front and center for many, many years. So I began thinking about museums and race and structural inequalities and questions of who does the museum speak for and who in the museum is speaking, in relation to a protest that emerged around the Whitney Museum of American Art in 2017. In 2017, the Whitney Biennial, which is the largest American art biennial in the country, one of the signal events in the U.S. art world, opened, and almost immediately, actually, the night of one of its press preview, the art critic Jerry Saltz put up a picture of a painting by the artist Dana Schutz, the white female artist Dana Schutz. And this painting was called Open Casket. And it was based on photographs of the 14-year-old boy, Emmett Till, who had been murdered by racists in the South, and whose mother, defying local authorities, insisted on having a funeral in which Emmett Till's casket was laid open in order for the press to be able to take photographs, in order for the people who came to be able to see, as she said, what has been done to her child. She wanted all the world to see what the horrors that had been visited on her child, who had been beaten almost beyond recognition for the simple fact of apparently having chatted up a white woman. And it turned out, as many of these stories do, that story that he had flirted with a white woman turned out many years later, it was confirmed that it was a complete fiction as well. So this was a sort of signal moment in the U.S. civil rights movement. It was a galvanizing moment thanks to Mamie Till Mobley's decision to have the casket be left open. The photographs of Emmett Till's body, I think, were so horrifying to people who had up until that point, especially white liberals who up until that point had been able to turn away from or conveniently ignore the sort of horrors of the Jim Crow South and other forms of really horrific racism in the US, they were no longer able to sit aside, and it very much kickstarted the civil rights movements of the 1960s. Dana Schutz painted this painting. Jerry Saltz posted it with a caption that read something like, "Isn't it beautiful?" And a number of people really reacted very strongly to the idea that an image of a dead Black child, of the body of a dead Black child, could be considered beautiful, and started questioning what what we do to images of Black death, how images of Black death are completely normalized as part of a visual landscape in this country in ways that go largely unquestioned. And this blew up online and in the streets as one of the most, a very consequential art protest. It spread like wildfire through pop culture. It was discussed on The View, it was discussed on all the cable news networks, and it became really a sort of 3-month-long, really, debate on social media, on traditional media, in art circles, and much more broadly. And so this led me to start thinking about the ways in which protest around questions of race had emerged almost like clockwork in the American art world, really, for decades. So I wrote a book that talked about this Whitney biennial controversy, but also talked about 2 other moments in what could have been really an endless multi-part history of protest and museums. And one of the other moments that I talked about was a 1969 exhibition called Harlem on My Mind, which happened at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1969, and was really interesting to me for a lot of the reasons, that have very much to do with what's happening in our world today. And I say this because this was an exhibition that the museum was putting on precisely in order to attract, acknowledge, and include African-American audiences at a museum that had been historically, literally off limits to African-Americans. When the at that time, newly appointed director of the Met, Thomas Hoving, arrived at the Met, he saw the guards turn away African-American visitors by telling them that the Met was a private club, which of course it wasn't in any sort of legal sense, but it functioned that way. And so the museum had, for many complicated reasons, not all of them just altruism, some of them were very complicated political reasons, the museum decided that it needed, in this moment of the civil rights movement, of a heightened sense of obligation to allow African Americans to participate fully in the cultural life of our cities. The Metropolitan Museum of Art decided to put on an exhibition that was the first exhibition it had ever done, which acknowledged the existence of American Black culture. In other words, they had put on shows that had shown, that had focused on African art from Africa, but never done anything to focus on Black culture in the US. And so this was the first show that they were putting on. And it was a spectacular, it was both a spectacular success in that it was one of the most popular exhibitions that the Met had put on. It attracted many, many visitors, including many African-American visitors. But it was also a spectacular failure in that it was the it was this sort of center of a great amount of protest and dissatisfaction, especially on the part of members of the Black arts community in New York, and specifically the Harlem community, who felt that they were being tokenized and used as subject matter for an exhibition rather than included as fully formed subjects and in fact art practitioners themselves. And one of the reasons for this is that the curator of this exhibition made the choice to focus on the history of Harlem as told through documentary photographs and text and other music and other forms, but didn't include a single work by an African-American painter or sculptor in the show. So no actual Black art defined at the time. Photography at that time didn't count as art for most museums in the US. But you know, Black painting and sculpture was not included in the show. And which obviously led to some really ill feelings among those members who had been asked to advise on the show in order to, you know, give the museum some credibility for putting on an exhibition like this. So many of the members of the Harlem community who had served as advisors felt that they had been used as window dressing or used for their you know, to improve the optics of the exhibition. But what was especially interesting to me is that about this exhibition and the way that I think it really connects to what's happening now is, first of all, the way in which the protests very much fed from a larger context of civil rights and, in fact, Black nationalist protest at the end of the 1960s, the emergence of the Black Panthers and the kinds of politically radical thinking that they were taking part in, that had very much to do with not so much the question of should Black people be included in institutions, right? Whether they be cultural institutions or educational institutions or whatever kind of institutions, political institutions. So the Black Panthers weren't interested in being included. They were interested in being full participants in those institutions in ways that allowed them to actually shape and mold those institutions. So not just present, you know, not just present at the table, but determining the menu and determining what time you eat and determining all of those things, right? So it was a kind of, it was a much more radical kind of understanding of what the purpose of civil rights should be than I think many white liberals had come to terms with, right? So that people just didn't want to just be let in the door. They actually wanted to have a kind of agency that was not being offered to them up until this point. And so what that meant for a group of artists that organized under the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition, under the auspices of this Black Emergency Cultural Coalition, was a set of radical proposals, not just about we want you to show Black artists, right? But it was actually forcing the museum, they wanted to force the museum to become not just a kind of neutral repository for art, whether that art was by white artists or by Black artists, but an actual advocate and activist in this larger moral struggle for civil rights and full citizenship for Black Americans. And so when they thought about what that meant, what a museum had to do in order to be a kind of legitimate institution, an institution that legitimately cared for the Black community as much as it cared for the white community, was that it would transform itself in order to serve that Black community as much as it had historically served its white community, which meant, for example, proposals that the Met should disperse its collections, that send artwork out to neighborhoods that were primarily Black and brown neighborhoods in New York, where residents weren't able to or didn't feel comfortable coming to Fifth Avenue and entering a building that looked, as some said, as much like a fortress as a museum. So the idea was that you would send art out to these places, to cultural centers, to community centers, so that people could actually experience the art that their tax dollars was also being used to support, right? That you would create, educational and internship programs so that people in Black and brown communities would recognize that museum careers were open to them as much as they were open to anyone else. That you would create mechanisms so that people who were incarcerated could experience the art of museums as well, since historically the prison system in the U.S. has, and the justice system in the U.S. has disproportionately affected Black and brown communities. Disproportionately sucked Black and brown communities into the system. So you have these proposals that for some people sounded completely beyond what a museum should do. But for the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition, as I said, who were thinking along the terms that were being developed and offered to them by Black nationalist thinkers, the question was a very clear one, and that is, and this is something that remains true, and I think that it's something that museums in this moment are having increasingly to come to terms with, that museums, if they cannot remain neutral in the face of white supremacy and racist discrimination, right, and racism, that there is no possibility of neutrality, that institutions either support the continued exclusion and the continued oppression of the Black community, or they support the destruction of racism and the continued oppression of the Black community. That there's no neutral position, that because any position of neutrality ends up by default supporting the continuation of those systems of oppression. And so the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition, I think, was one of the most interesting things, and one of the things that I think is now sort of being echoed in a lot of challenges that are being made in the wake of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, challenges that are being made now by activists who are confronting museums all over the country, is an echo, really, of what the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition was saying, which is that there is no possibility for a museum to be neutral. If you're neutral, you're on the side of white supremacy, right? The only way that one can operate in this time is to be activists, to actively break down those systems and structures that marginalize Black people and their histories. Um, and so to me, thinking back to this moment in the late 1960s and the way in which larger questions of civil rights, larger battles for civil rights spilled into the cultural space is really instructive for thinking now about how museums are being forced to reckon with their own hiring practices, with their own exhibition histories, with the composition of their collections, with the ways in which they engage the communities in which they're situated, with the ways that they envision their audience. And I think that it's going to be really instructive to see how museums respond to this. So far, it feels like museums have not been able to fall back on their on in the way that often institutions have in their past of making a few gestures towards diversity and inclusion, and then quietly sort of going back to business as usual. That there have been a number of high profile resignations, investigations, commitments on the part of museums to undertake deep reckonings with their own practices in order to understand their own complicity with the sorts of thinking that and the sorts of practices that led to and that lead to on a unconscionable in an unconscionable frequency to violence against Black people by the state. So with those remarks, I think I've gone for as long as I should. Maybe it's time to bring Millicent back.
Thank you, Aruna.
Thank you.
I'm just going to take a few moments to see if we have any questions from our audience. Okay, I have a statement that, wow, that's so astonishing that Black artistry wasn't even included. I'm truly saddened by that. I'm sure that's reference to the MoMA show.
To the Met show, yeah.
The Met, yeah, sorry.
There were, I mean, what's interesting is that, the photographer, for example, the photographer James Edmonton, one of the great figures in Harlem photography, who was a young Black photographer at the time. I mean, he was always a Black photographer, but he was younger at the time. But his work was included in the show and came to prominence because of his inclusion in the show. But one of the problems with Harlem on My Mind is it was really, it had a very radical exhibition design, and it was sort of, it was about like creating this sort of information environment. And so the photographs that were included were blown up or reduced or layered with text in order to serve this larger information environment and not treated as art. So someone like Roy DeCarava, for example, refused to have his photography in the show because the photography wouldn't be treated, as he said, with the respect it deserved, because it was sort of part of this graphic design thing. But yeah, no Black painters or sculptors in the show at all. And needless to say, the Met had never at this point, till this point, shown any Black painters or sculptors. So the exclusion from this first exhibition about Black American culture was, huge, massive.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it's worth noting, I think, Aruna, right, that you had major figures like Norman Lewis and Romare Bearden that were participating in this emergency coalition that are now considered like masters of American art, that were just completely not let into, just weren't even, it was like two different worlds existing, it sounds like.
It was, and Faith Ringgold as well. There were, a lot of some of our most revered Black artists of that generation were part of this protest. And it should also be noted that, at the same time, one of the reasons I think that that these artists felt so empowered to take on the Met and the Whitney, like they were taking on multiple white institutions, is precisely because the Studio Museum in Harlem had established there were a sort of string of very important Black-owned galleries in Harlem. There were artist groups who were forming in Harlem. And so there was a kind of, there was a sense of having developed a separate and equal infrastructure, right? And a separate infrastructure that was doing the kinds of work that the white institutions should be doing. So, when the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition protested an exhibition at the Whitney Museum that was around this time, that was on the 1930s, right? One of the moments, right? When the Harlem Renaissance, there was great energy in American art, Black American art at that moment. And the Whitney show didn't include a single Black artist. And so the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition protested, but at the same time, an exhibition was mounted in Harlem of Black artists from the 1930s, right? So it wasn't simply met with protest at being excluded. These were artists and curators and art historians who were actually doing the work of saying, this is what you left out, right? Like this is, we're going to create what we want to see in the world, right? And in a very powerful way.
Thank you. Our next question is, did Black colleges in the early 20th century have art classes for their students in addition to the academic courses? Did the college exhibit the artwork of these students?
So I'll say from the beginning, I am by far not an expert on the historically Black colleges and universities and their art programs, but there were art history classes and art classes. And in fact, the first woman to receive an MFA degree in art was Elizabeth Catlett, right? So it was a Black woman, right? So there was, so this was not a matter of there simply weren't, so I don't know if everyone knows, the art historian Linda Nochlin once wrote an article called "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" Right? And she wrote this in the early 70s. And, at the time, right, the late 60s, early 70s was, lots of people were clamoring for civil rights, including white women. And so she wrote this article. And one of the things that she noted is that white women had been, or European American women had been excluded from a lot of things like art schools and studio training and everything like that. So they didn't have the opportunity to sort of develop their expertise as artists for a very long time, not really until the late 18th century. But that was not the case in the US for, by this time in the late 60s, there were, there were plenty of artists who could have been included in shows, but this was less a matter of, although it was often sort of talked about as a matter of, well, museums, white museums would say, we're not interested in quotas, we just want to put up the best art, right? So it was often argued in terms of quality. It really was simply a matter of segregation and exclusion.
Thank you. We have something from Catherine Lavender. She says, in terms of the need to actively open institutions through internships, et cetera, I teach museum studies at the graduate level at CUNY, and I have struggled to get our students opportunities to intern at the Met, especially. They have formal arrangements with Columbia and NYU, but are not very interested in CUNY. Any advice?
Well, well, that's in terms of advice. I think that this becomes a matter of um, all of us in the art world who have a stake in the art world and in wanting to make the art world more inclusive, having to really push museums to change their ways. I mean, one of the problems is that museums, you know, many museums, and I won't say all, I think there are other museums other than the Met who do a much better job of targeting internships to public colleges and universities and historically Black colleges and universities and things like that. But I think that, you know, one of the problems is that has been this strange kind of morphing of our idea of what constitutes a proper credential, so that, you know, I have definitely been in rooms where people have said, you know, throw out all the applications that are coming from people who aren't from Ivy League schools, which is ridiculous, right? I mean, what you've done then is basically, you know, thrown out most of your possibility of having, you know, students of color or applicants of color, right?
Yes.
In your application pool. And so I think that and those things, again, they are justified according to ideas of expertise or qualification when they have nothing to do with that. A person, you know, what do interns do at museums? You know, I would say that you know, there's nothing that an intern is doing that couldn't be done by a student from a public community college as well as a student from an Ivy League school. But we definitely do have, you know, I think there is a real elitism often that guides our art institutions, especially art historians. And you know, whatever, I started out there as an art historian, so I can't be innocent of this, but art historians are not known for their, you know, democratic thinking. I'll say we tend to be surrounded by elitists, and I think that elitism is one of the, you know, is a powerful gatekeeper, right? Both, and in this case, both for people of color and for you know, white Americans who come from, you know, differing class, you know, working class or you know, lower class backgrounds. So I think that you know, that's a huge thing, and that's something that both from within and outside of museums we have to be pushing on them to change. And I think that making those things visible, sort of letting a museum know that we know what they're doing, and we know that how it's affecting our students, and especially our students of color. I think that right now is the time to let museums know that, because I think no one's under the illusion that most institutions can keep operating according to business as usual at this point.
Thank you. I have another question. Thank you for sharing. And how can African Americans support the arts? How to collect art?
Well, again, I'm not the expert in this, but I know that there, you know, one of the things that's really interesting to me is the way in which young collectors, young Black collectors especially, are emerging now as very powerful figures in the art world. And some of those are very rich collectors who are, you know, like Swizz Beatz and Alicia Keys are major collectors in the art world, for example, and they're really, you know, powerful figures as a result. But there are a lot of young, you know, normal, regular, everyday collectors that are emerging. And I think one of the best ways to do it is to hook up with some of the emerging Black art galleries, you know, certainly in Newark, but also in New York City. You know, there's Project for an Empty Space is an amazing project that's run by uh, uh, African-American woman who's showing some of the most, I'm sorry, I said Project for an Empty Space, that's actually in Newark, but We Buy Gold is what I was just now talking about. Um, African-American woman who is showing some of the most cutting edge artists right now. The Arcades Project is another gallery run by a younger African-American gallerist. And I think that you know, if collecting is your thing, hooking up with a Black-owned gallery and really exploring some of the younger artists making work is a great idea. But I think in general, supporting the arts doesn't require collecting. It requires paying attention, and it requires going to shows. It requires going to museums and letting museums know that you want more programming around Black artists or artists of color, Indigenous artists, that you want to see the programming of galleries, of museums, of public art shows, of all of those things uh, in ways that reflect the communities in which you live and in which you thrive, right? And it also, I think, requires, or certainly would be supported by, a support of art in the community, even if it's not being done by professional artists. So programs at community centers, art schools in schools, programs run by museums that are open to the public, because I think art is a really powerful way in which one builds community and one empowers communities to understand that they can create the world, you know, that they can create worlds, that they can create better worlds and more just worlds and more beautiful worlds. So, you know, I think all of those things are true.
Okay, unfortunately, we're getting close to our time and we can take one more question. This question is, what are some of the steps and actions that you would like to see an institution like the Met take in order to oppose white supremacy?
So the Metropolitan Museum of Art hired its first Black curator in 2019. Now think about that.
Wow.
2019, it took them to hire, you know, Dr. Denise Morel, who's, you know, who curated a brilliant show that was first shown at Columbia and then went on to the Musée d'Orsay in Paris on the figure of the Black model in late 19th century art. It was a sort of game-changing exhibition, but 2019 it took. So Ibrahim X. Kendi, who's a person that I think a lot more people know about now than they maybe did before, who writes a lot on the history of racism, and his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, I think a lot of people have been reading since the George Floyd murders, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor murders. Ibrahim X. Kendi has a very simple formula, and he says that if an institution's hiring practices, right, don't reflect the makeup of the community in which they are situated, if an institution has a mostly white staff and exists in a place that is diverse, that is a racist institution, period, right? Because that is one of the most fundamental ways in which an institution declares its values in terms of who it hires and where those people are hired, into what jobs those people are hired. And I think that the art world has long used an excuse that there simply aren't enough qualified curators, directors, department head level people in order to in order to diversify their staff. But at the same time, institutions like the Studio Museum, like the Brooklyn Museum, even like the Perez Art Museum in Miami, like other institutions, have much more diverse staff than a museum like the Met. So to me, whenever I hear that we can't, there aren't enough people, to me, I think, okay, but all those, although I've worked at a lot of museums and I can tell you that not all those white guys working at museums are like the brightest bulbs on the tree, right? Like, like it's not like every person working at a museum is somehow the best possible employee they could possibly be. And so the idea that you can't hire people, from many different backgrounds and many different walks of life doesn't ring true to me. And so I think the first thing that a museum has to do is understand and just change and hire, a more diverse staff. And if they can't, they have to, and if they say they can't, they have to examine every step of the way that is acting as a barrier to their own fixing of the problem. And I think that until that happens, everything else becomes really uh, uh, sort of window dressing, because I think that the fundamental thing that museums do when they don't hire people from all backgrounds is they are allowing culture to be held by, to be framed by, to be communicated by one group of people, right, to the exclusion of others. So to me, that's the top of the list. That's the list. And then once you start figuring that out, the rest, potentially becomes easier to envisage.
Thank you. My apologies to everyone who has questions waiting. We are getting close into the end of our program right now, but they were really wonderful questions. I wish we had more time to continue this discussion. And I just want to thank you, Aruna and Tricia, for joining us today for this very necessary conversation. And to our viewers, I'd like to ask if you would please stay tuned as we will be continuing our Community Day programming. Up next, we have poet Alexis Green and music by Give Me That at 3 p.m. It will be broadcast on Zoom only, so you can sign up on our website. And later today, our mayor of Newark, Ross Baraka, and our director of the Newark Museum of Art, Linda Harrison, will be in conversation on the topic of Newark, the progressive city. And that will be this afternoon at 4:00 p.m. That will be broadcasted on Zoom and Facebook Live. And thank you both again. And I thank you all for joining us. Stay safe and stay strong.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Take care.